Puritan.
The Puritans were a group of English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries, including, but not limited to, English Calvinists. Puritanism in this sense was founded by some Marian exiles from the clergy shortly after the accession of Elizabeth I of England in 1558, as an activist movement within the Church of England. In modern times, the word Puritan is often used to mean against pleasure. Historically, the word was used pejoratively to characterize the Protestant group as extremists, similar to the Cathars of France and, according to Thomas Fuller in his Church History, dated back to 1564. Archbishop Matthew Parker of that time used it and Precisian with a sense of the modern stickler. Puritans were blocked from changing the established church from within, and were severely restricted in England by laws controlling the practice of religion. Their views, however, were transported by the immigration of congregations to the Netherlands, and later to New England, and by evangelical clergy to Ireland, and later into Wales, and were spread into lay society and parts of the educational system, particularly certain colleges of the University of Cambridge. They took on distinctive views on clerical dress and in opposition to the episcopal system, particularly after the 1619 conclusions of the Synod of Dort. They were resisted by the English bishops. They largely adopted Sabbatarian views in the 17th century, and were influenced by millennialism. In alliance with the growing commercial world, the parliamentary opposition to the royal prerogative, and in the late 1630s with the Scottish Presbyterians with whom they had much in common, the Puritans became a major political force in England and came to power as a result of the First English Civil War, 1642-46. After the Restoration of 1660 and the 1662 Uniformity Act, almost all Puritan clergy left the Church of England, some becoming nonconformist ministers. The nature of the movement in England changed radically, although it retained its character for a much longer period in New England. Puritans, by definition, were dissatisfied with the limited extent of the English Reformation, and the Church of England's tolerance of practices which they associated with the Catholic Church. They formed, and identified with, various religious groups advocating greater purity of worship and doctrine, as well as personal and group piety. Puritans adopted a Reformed theology and, in that sense, were Calvinists, as were many of their earlier opponents, but they also took note of radical views critical of Zwingli in Zurich and Calvin in Geneva. In church polity, some advocated for separation from all other Christians, in favor of autonomous gather churches. These separatist and independent strands of Puritanism became prominent in the 1640s, when the supporters of a Presbyterian polity in the Westminster Assembly were unable to forge a new English national church.
Terminology.
In this sense, the term Puritan was coined in the 1560s, when it appeared as a term of abuse for those who found the Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 inadequate.
The godly.
The word Puritan is applied unevenly to a number of Protestant churches, and religious groups within the Anglican Church, from the late 16th century onwards. Puritans did not originally use the term for themselves. The practitioners knew themselves as members of particular churches or movements, and not by a single term. Praecismen and Precisians were other early derogatory terms for Puritans, who preferred to call themselves the godly. The 17th-century English Puritan preacher Thomas Watson used the godly to describe Puritans in the title of one of his more famous works, The Godly Man's Picture. The term Puritan cannot strictly be used to describe any new religious group after the 17th century.
Puritans and separatists.
Puritans who were not satisfied with the Reformation of the Church of England, but who remained within the Church of England advocating further reforms, are known as non-separating Puritans. This group disagreed among themselves about how much further reformation was necessary. Those who thought that the Church of England was so corrupt that true Christians should separate from it altogether are known as separating Puritans, or simply separatists. Puritan, in the wider sense, includes both groups. Separatists were a group who advocated complete separation from the Church of England, but had no particular church title. Many of the Mayflower Pilgrims were referred to only as separatists. John Winthrop and the other main leaders of emigration to New England in 1629 were non-separating Puritans. However, John Robinson and William Brewster, the Pilgrim leaders, were separatists. There is no current consensus among historians whether separatists can properly be counted as Puritans. Especially after the English Restoration of 1660, separating Puritans were called dissenters. The 1662 Uniformity Act caused almost all Puritan clergy to leave the Church of England. Some became nonconformist ministers. The movement in England changed radically at this time, though this change was not as immediate for Puritans in New England.
Puritans and killjoys.
In modern usage, the word Puritan is often used to describe someone who adheres to strict moral or religious principles. In this usage, hedonism and Puritanism are antonyms. Peter Gay writes of the Puritan standard reputation for dour prudery as a misreading that went unquestioned in the 19th century, commenting how unpuritanical they were in favor of married sexuality, and in opposition to the Catholic view of virginity, citing Edward Taylor and John Cotton.
Summary history.
Puritanism has a historical importance over a period of a century, followed by 50 years of development in New England. It changed character and emphasis almost decade by decade over that time.
Elizabethan Puritanism.
Elizabethan Puritanism contended with the Elizabethan religious settlement, with little to show for it. The Lambeth Articles of 1595, a high watermark for Calvinism within the Church of England, failed to receive royal approval.
Jacobean Puritanism.
The accession of James I brought the Millenary Petition, a Puritan manifesto of 1603 for reform of the English Church, but James wanted a new religious settlement along different lines. He called the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, and heard the views of 4 prominent Puritan leaders there, including Lawrence Chatterton, but largely sided with his bishops. Well informed by his education and Scottish upbringing on theological matters, he dealt shortly with a peevish legacy of Elizabethan Puritanism, and tried to pursue an Irenic religious policy, in which he was arbiter. Many of his episcopal appointments were Calvinists, notably James Montague, who was an influential courtier. Puritans still opposed much of the Catholic summation in the Church of England, notably the Book of Common Prayer, but also the use of non-secular vestments, cap and gown, during services, the sign of the cross in baptism, and kneeling to receive Holy Communion. Although the Puritan movement was subjected to repression by some of the bishops under both Elizabeth and James, other bishops were more tolerant and, in many places, individual ministers were able to omit disliked portions of the Book of Common Prayer. The Puritan movement of Jacobean times became distinctive by adaptation and compromise, with the emergence of semi-separatism, moderate Puritanism, the writings of William Bradshaw, who adopted the term Puritan as self-identification, and the beginnings of Congregationalism. Most Puritans of this period were non-separating and remained within the Church of England, and separatists who left the Church of England altogether were numerically much fewer.
Fragmentation and political failure.
The Puritan movement in England was riven over decades by immigration and inconsistent interpretations of Scripture, and some political differences that surfaced at that time. The Westminster Assembly, an assembly of clergy of the Church of England, was called in 1643. Doctrinally, the assembly was able to agree to the Westminster Confession of Faith, a consistent Reformed theological position. The Directory of Public Worship was made official in 1645, and the larger framework, now called the Westminster Standards, was adopted by the Church of Scotland. In England, the standards were contested by independents up to 1660. The Westminster divines were, on the other hand, divided over questions of church polity, and split into factions supporting a Reformed episcopacy, Presbyterianism, Congregationalism, and Erastianism. Although the membership of the Assembly was heavily weighted towards the Presbyterians, Oliver Cromwell was a Congregationalist separatist who imposed his views. the Church of England of the interregnum was run along Presbyterian lines, but never became a national Presbyterian church, such as existed in Scotland, and England was not the theocratic state which leading Puritans had called for as godly rule.
Great Ejection and Dissenters.
At the time of the English Restoration in 1660, the Savoy Conference was called to determine a new religious settlement for England and Wales. With only minor changes, the Church of England was restored to its pre-Civil War constitution under the Act of Uniformity 1662, and the Puritans found themselves sidelined. A traditional estimate of the historian Calamy is that around 2,400 Puritan clergy left the Church in the Great Ejection of 1662. At this point, the term dissenter came to include Puritan, but more accurately describes those, clergy or lay, who dissented from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Dividing themselves from all Christians in the Church of England, the dissenters established their own separatist congregations in the 1660s and 1670s. An estimated 1,800 of the ejected clergy continued in some fashion as ministers of religion, according to Richard Baxter. The government initially attempted to suppress these schismatic organizations by the Clarendon Code. There followed a period in which schemes of comprehension were proposed, under which Presbyterians could be brought back into the Church of England. Nothing resulted from them. The Whigs, opposing the court religious policies, argued that the dissenters should be allowed to worship separately from the established church, and this position ultimately prevailed when the Toleration Act was passed in the wake of the Glorious Revolution in 1689. This permitted the licensing of dissenting ministers and the building of chapels. The term nonconformist generally replaced the term dissenter from the middle of the 18th century.
Beliefs.
The idea of personal biblical interpretation, while central to Puritan beliefs, was shared with most Protestants in general. Puritans sought both individual and corporate conformity to the teaching of the Bible, with moral purity pursued both down to the smallest detail, as well as ecclesiastical purity to the highest level. They believed that man existed for the glory of God, that his first concern in life was to do God's will and so to receive future happiness.
Diversity.
Various strands of Calvinist thought of the 17th century were taken up by different parts of the Puritan movement and, in particular, immoralism was adopted by some influential figures, including John Davenant, Samuel Wood and, to some extent, Richard Baxter. In the same fashion, there is no theory of church polity that is uniquely Puritan, and views differed beyond opposition to Erastianism, state control, though even that at its small group of supporters in the Westminster Assembly. Some approved of the existing church hierarchy with bishops, but others sought to reform the Episcopal churches on the Presbyterian model. Some separatist Puritans were Presbyterian, but most were early Congregationalists. The separating Congregationalists believed the divine right of kings was heresy but, on the other hand, there were many Royalist Presbyterians, in terms of allegiance in the political struggle. Migration also brought out differences and brought together Puritan communities with their own regional customs and beliefs. As soon as there were New World Puritans, their views on church governance diverged from those remaining in the British Isles, who faced different issues.
Demonology.
Puritans believed in demonic forces, as did almost all Christians of this period. Puritan pastors undertook exorcisms for demonic possession in some high-profile cases, and believed in some allegations of witchcraft. The exorcist John Darrell was supported by Arthur Hildesham in the case of Thomas Darling. Samuel Harsnett, a skeptic on witchcraft and possession, attacked Darrell. However, Harsnett was in the minority, and many clergy, not only Puritans, took the opposite viewpoint. The possession case of Richard Dugdale was taken up by the ejected nonconformist Thomas Jolly and other local ministers in 1689. The context of the Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 shows the intricacy of trying to place Puritan beliefs as distinctive. The publication of Sadducismus Triumphatus, an anti-skeptical tract that has been implicated in the moral panic at Salem, involved Joseph Glanville, a latitudinarian, and Henry Moore, a Cambridge Platonist, as editors, and Anthony Horneck, an evangelical German Anglican, as translator of a pamphlet about a Swedish witch hunt. None of these was a Puritan. Glanville and Moore had been vehemently opposed in the 1670s by the skeptic John Webster, an independent and sometime chaplain to the parliamentary forces.
Millennialism.
Puritan millennialism has been placed in the broader context of European Reformed views on the millennium and interpretation of biblical prophecy, for which representative figures of the period were Johannes Piscator, Thomas Brightman, Joseph Mead, Johannes Heinrich Alsted, and John Amos Comenius. Both Brightman and Mead were Puritan by conviction, and so are identified as such by their biographers, though neither clashed with the church authorities. David Brady describes a lull before the storm in which, in the early 17th century, reasonably restrained and systematic Protestant exegesis of the Book of Revelation was seen with Brightman, Mead and Hugh Broughton, after which apocalyptic literature became too easily debased as it became more populist and less scholarly. Within the Church, William Lamont argues, the Elizabethan millennial views of John Foxe became sidelined, with Puritans adopting instead the centrifugal views of Brightman, while the Laudians replaced the centripetal attitude of Foxe to the Christian emperor by the national and episcopal church closer to home, with its royal head, as leading the Protestant world or divino, by divine right. Viggo Noskov-Olsen writes that Mead broke fully away from the Augustinian Foxian tradition, and is the link between Brightman and the premillennialism of the 17th century. The dam broke in 1641 when the traditional retrospective reverence for Thomas Cranmer and other martyred bishops in the Acts and Monuments was displaced by forward-looking attitudes to prophecy among radical Puritans.
Cultural consequences.
Some strong religious views common to Puritans had direct impacts on culture. Education was essential to the masses, so that they could read the Bible for themselves. The opposition to acting as public performance, typified by William Prynne's History or Mastics, was not a concern with drama as a form. John Milton wrote Samson Agonist as verse drama, and had, at an early stage, contemplated writing Paradise Lost in that form. N. H. Cabell writes, but the sexualization of Restoration theatre was attacked as strongly as ever by Thomas Gouge, as Cabell points out. Puritans eliminated the use of musical instruments in their religious services for theological and practical reasons. The only music remaining in church services was the setting of the Psalms. Church organs were commonly damaged or destroyed in the Civil War period, such as when an axe was taken to the organ of Worcester Cathedral in 1642.
Family life.
Puritans placed family at the center of their societies, as an organization to facilitate their devotion to God. Based on biblical portrayals of Adam and Eve, Puritans believed that marriage represented one of the most fundamental human relationships rooted in procreation, love, and, most importantly, salvation. According to Puritans, husbands were the spiritual head of the household, while women were to demonstrate religious piety and obedience under male authority. Furthermore, marriage represented not only the relationship between husband and wife, but also the relationship between spouses and God. Puritan husbands commanded authority through family direction and prayer. The female relationship to her husband and to God was marked by submissiveness and humility. Puritans believed wives to be spiritual equals to their husbands. Puritan author Thomas Gurtaker describes Puritan marriage as the paradox created by female inferiority in the public sphere and the spiritual equality of men and women in marriage, then, gave way to the informal authority of women concerning matters of the home and child-rearing. With the consent of their husbands, Puritan wives made important decisions concerning the labor of their children, property, and the management of inns and taverns owned by their husbands. For Puritans, motherhood represented the most significant aspect of the female identity. Pious Puritan mothers labored for their children's righteousness and salvation, connecting women directly to matters of religion and morality. In her poem titled In Reference to Her Children, poet Anne Bradstreet reflects on her role as a mother. Bradstreet alludes to the temporality of motherhood by comparing her children to a flock of birds on the precipice of leaving home. While Puritans praised the obedience of young children, they also believed that, by separating children from their mothers at adolescence, children could better sustain a superior relationship with God. According to Puritans, children entered the world with a stain of original sin. A child could only be redeemed through religious education and obedience. Girls carried the additional burden of Eve's corruption and were catechized separately from boys at adolescence. Boys' education prepared them for vocations and leadership roles, while girls were educated for domestic and religious purposes. The pinnacle of achievement for children in Puritan society, however, occurred with the conversion process. Puritans thrust paternal caretaking responsibilities upon masters in relation to their servants. Puritans viewed the relationship between master and servant similarly to that of parent and child. Just as parents were expected to uphold Puritan religious values in the home, masters assumed the parental responsibility of housing and educating young servants. Older servants also dwelt with masters and were cared for in the event of illness or injury. African American and Indian servants were likely excluded from such benefits.
New England Puritans.
Particularly in the years after 1630, Puritans left for New England. See Migration to New England, 1620 to 1640, supporting the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other settlements. The large-scale Puritan emigration to New England ceased by 1641, with around 21,000 having moved across the Atlantic. This English-speaking population in America did not all consist of original colonists, since many returned to England shortly after arriving on the continent, but produced more than 16 million descendants. This so-called Great Migration is not so named because of sheer numbers, which were much less than the number of English citizens who emigrated to Virginia and the Caribbean during this time. The rapid growth of the New England colonies, around 700,000 by 1790, was almost entirely due to the high birth rate and lower death rate per year. Puritan hegemony lasted for at least a century. That century can be broken down into three parts: the generation of John Cotton and Richard Mather, 1630 to 1661 from the founding to the Restoration, years of virtual independence and nearly autonomous development. The generation of Increase Mather, 1662 to 1689 from the Restoration and the Halfway Covenant to the Glorious Revolution, years of struggle with the British Crown. And the generation of Cotton Mather, 1689 to 1728 from the overthrow of Edmund Andros, in which Cotton Mather played a part, and the new charter, mediated by Increase Mather, to the death of Cotton Mather.
Education.
In the area of education, New England differed from its mother country, where nothing in English statute required schoolmasters or the literacy of children. With the possible exception of Scotland, the Puritan model of education in New England was unique. John Winthrop in 1630 claimed that the society they would form in New England would be as a city upon a hill, and the colony leaders would educate all. These were men of letters. They had attended Oxford or Cambridge, and communicated with intellectuals all over Europe. In 1636, they founded the school that soon became Harvard College. Besides the Bible, children needed to read to understand. The capital laws of this country, as the Massachusetts Code declared, order being of the utmost importance, and children not taught to read would grow barbarous. The 1648 amendment to the Massachusetts law and the 1650 Connecticut Code, both used the word barbarism. By the 1670s, all New England colonies, except Rhode Island, had passed legislation that mandated literacy for children. In 1647, Massachusetts passed a law that required towns to hire a schoolmaster to teach writing. Forms of schooling ranged from dame schools to Latin schools for boys already literate in English and ready to master preparatory grammar for Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Reading schools would often be the single source of education for girls, whereas boys would go to the town grammar schools. Gender largely determined educational practices. Women introduced all children to reading, and men taught boys in higher pursuits. Since girls could play no role in the ministry, and since grammar schools were designed to instruct youth so far as they may be fitted for the university, Latin grammar schools did not accept girls, nor did Harvard. Most evidence suggests that girls could not attend the less ambitious town schools, the lower-tier writing-reading schools mandated for townships of over 50 families.
Restrictions and pleasures.
The Plymouth Colony Puritans of New England disapproved of Christmas celebrations, as did some other Protestant churches of the time. Celebration was outlawed in Boston from 1659. The ban was revoked in 1681 by the English-appointed governor Sir Edmund Andros, who also revoked a Puritan ban on festivities on Saturday nights. Nevertheless, it was not until the mid-19th century that celebrating Christmas became fashionable in the Boston region. Likewise, the colonies banned many secular entertainments on moral grounds, such as games of chance, maypoles, and drama. They were not, however, opposed to drinking alcohol in moderation. Early New England laws banning the sale of alcohol to Native Americans were criticized because it was not fit to deprive Indians of any lawful comfort alloweth to all men by the use of wine. Laws banned the practice of individuals toasting each other, with the explanation that it led to wasting God's gift of beer and wine, as well as being carnal. Bounds were not set on enjoying sexuality within the bounds of marriage, as a gift from God. In fact, spouses, albeit, in practice, mainly females, were disciplined if they did not perform their sexual marital duties, in accordance with 1 Corinthians 7 and other biblical passages. Puritans publicly punished drunkenness and sexual relations outside marriage.
Opposition to Quakerism.
The Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were the most active of the New England persecutors of Quakers, and the persecuting spirit was shared by the Plymouth Colony and the colonies along the Connecticut River. In 1660, one of the most notable victims of the religious intolerance was English Quaker Mary Dyer, who was hanged in Boston for repeatedly defying a Puritan law banning Quakers from the colony. She was one of the 4 executed Quakers known as the Boston Martyrs. In 1661, King Charles II explicitly forbade Massachusetts from executing anyone for professing Quakerism. In 1684, England revoked the Massachusetts Charter, sent over a royal governor to enforce English laws in 1686 and, in 1689, passed a Broad Toleration Act.
The Puritan spirit in the United States.
Alexis de Tocqueville suggested in Democracy in America that Puritanism was the very thing that provided a firm foundation for American democracy. As Sheldon Wallen puts it, Tocqueville was aware of the harshness and bigotry of the early colonists. However, on the other hand, he saw them as archaic survivals, not only in their piety and discipline but in their democratic practices. The theme of a religious basis of economic discipline is echoed in sociologist Max Weber's work, but both de Tocqueville and Weber argued that this discipline was not a force of economic determinism, but one factor among many that should be considered when evaluating the relative economic success of the Puritans.
Historiography.
The literature on Puritans, particularly biographical literature on individual Puritan ministers, was already voluminous in the 17th century and, indeed, the interests of Puritans in the narratives of early life and conversions made the recording of the internal lives important to them. The historical literature on Puritans is, however, quite problematic and subject to controversies over interpretation. The early writings are those of the defeated, excluded and victims. The great interest of authors of the 19th century in Puritan figures was routinely accused in the 20th century of consisting of anachronism and the reading back of contemporary concerns. A debate continues on the definition of Puritanism. English historian Patrick Collinson has an extreme view that Puritanism had no content beyond what was attributed to it by its opponents. The analysis of mainstream Puritanism in terms of the evolution from it of separatist and antinomian groups that did not flourish, and others that continue to this day, such as Baptists and Quakers, can suffer in this way, as well as risk an incoherent view of where the burden of belief lay for the godly. The national context, England and Wales, as well as the kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland, frames the definition of Puritans, but was not a self-identification for those Protestants who saw the progress of the 30 Years' War from 1620 as directly bearing on their denomination, and as a continuation of the religious wars of the previous century, carried on by the English Civil Wars. English historian Christopher Hill, who has contributed Marxist analyses of Puritan concerns that are more respected than accepted, writes of the 1630s, Old Church lands, and the accusations that Laud was a crypto-Catholic. Puritans were politically important in England, but it is debated whether the movement was in any way a party with policies and leaders before the early 1640s. While Puritanism in New England was important culturally for a group of colonial pioneers in America, there have been many studies trying to pin down exactly what the identifiable cultural component was. Fundamentally, historians remain dissatisfied with the grouping as Puritan as a working concept for historical explanation. The conception of a Protestant work ethic, identified more closely with Calvinist or Puritan principles, has been criticized at its root, mainly as a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy aligning economic success with a narrow religious scheme.